My honest thoughts on the Let Them theory by Mel Robbins and also her daughter, Sawyer Robbins. So I spent the last couple of weeks reading through this book and obviously taking a whole bunch of notes for this video. So I'm going to be going through the things I think are really good in the book and some areas I think maybe aren't as good, and just give my honest opinion as I kind of work through these chapters. So I originally saw this book online. I think it's everywhere. It's one of the bestsellers. It's at the top of lots of audiobook lists as well. So I thought, why not give it a read? Loads of people are talking about it. And to be fair, I've never actually seen too many videos of Mel Robbins of her own content, but I have seen her on other people's podcasts and seen clips online of her talking. And I do really like some of the messages she shared. So I thought, why not buy her book and go through it? And hopefully I can learn a few things as I go through it. So the book is divided up into 8 chapters. So what I'll do is I'll go through each of those chapters and just talk about some of the things I thought was beneficial from it and give some of my thoughts and opinions on it. So she starts off opening the book by introducing herself and her story. She then talks about what the Let Them theory is. She talks about managing stress, fearing other people's opinions, which is an interesting one. We've got dealing with someone else's emotional reactions. That one resonated with me quite well. Overcoming chronic comparison. That was also quite a good chapter. Mastering adult friendship, motivating other people to change, helping someone who is struggling. Those 2 chapters are quite similar. And then choosing the love you deserve, which, to be honest, from my perspective, I didn't think it was the best chapter of them all. But nevertheless, there's a couple of good things I pulled out of it. So the book starts off with Mel talking about her backstory. She talks about her life before she was famous and had all this money. So she was 41. I think she used to work in finance, or she was a lawyer or something like that. She might have lost her job. Her and her husband were in around something insane, like 800K's worth of debt. Her husband's restaurant business wasn't doing very well. She was drinking and she was more or less just avoiding her life in general. So she wasn't in a massively good place. So that really sets the scene for the book in terms of where she was, how she got there. And I think the purpose of doing that really is to kind of emphasize how the Let Them theory may have helped her get to where she is to now. So you can make of that what you will, but nevertheless, it set the scene quite nicely. And it does make Mel quite relatable as a person. And throughout the whole book, she does give quite a few personal stories and bits and pieces in there. But at the same time, you do think to yourself, have some of these things been planted in there tactically to try to make the theory seem a bit better? But that might just be because I'm a little bit cynical. The theory is introduced at the beginning of the book. So after the instruction, a kind of backstory. So she talks about stop wasting your life on things you can't control, which I think is quite a pertinent thing. It's quite powerful. So that's where she really talks about the Let Them theory. And there's 2 parts actually to that. There's Let Them, which is all about letting go of control over other people's opinions, other people's choices, other people's behaviors, basically anything external from yourself that realistically you don't have control over. And then there's the Let Me part, which is essentially how am I going to respond or work with the things that are within my control. So you let go of other people and their kind of opinions, behaviors, etc. And then you just focus on what you're going to do yourself. And throughout this book, there's a few different chapters, as I mentioned before, where you kind of have to apply this theory in each of them. So some of the feedback in some of the other videos is actually that this theory is, and this book's probably a bit too long, but I think sometimes it is helpful to plant this theory across different areas. So we'll go through them and I'll share kind of my thoughts on that. Just a bit of a backstory on the Let Them theory. So apparently in this book, this is where it's probably come from. She talks about her son's prom, and as a mother, she does come across somebody who maybe for her own right reasons, she oversteps lots of boundaries, but that could probably be quite annoying for her kids. So her son is having a prom. There's loads of things that aren't organized, and basically she starts getting stressed out over his situation, whereas he's actually fine over how things are going. The transport isn't sorted, the dinner reservations aren't sorted, it's raining outside, they haven't really thought through the plan. And she's stressing and trying to problem solve. And then I think her daughter, it might even be Sawyer, basically says, Mum, let them go out without a dinner reservation, let them go out without, coats on, let them go out or whatever without a plan. And apparently that's where this theory's kind of blown up from. I think Mel done some work on social media, she done some posts and it's completely blown up. And it blew up so much that people have actually got some tattoos. And in the book, there's actually a whole bunch of people who have got tattoos saying let them. And to be fair, some of them are quite nice. It's probably not something I would personally do, but if it really resonates with you, I can see why. But it just goes to show actually that this is quite a powerful message that she has shared. So I can see why they've obviously come and written a book about it. The first chapters, they're divided by these kind of black pages in the book if you do get hold of the book. So this is about managing stress, and this is a cluster of some mini chapters. And I'll try to summarize these for you for some of the things I thought were quite helpful from them. So she talks about when you are stressed, stress is essentially something that you're choosing to have in certain situations. So she gives a bit of an example where you're in a rush, you're trying to get somewhere, and there's a cashier behind the desk. Maybe you're getting petrol, maybe you're at a shop or wherever it might be. And they're going really slow. It's slowing down your day. It's completely ruining your day. But she's basically saying that you're not stressed by the situation. You're actually stressed by your reaction to that situation. And I think that's probably quite a powerful message, particularly it is for me, because sometimes when you're in those situations, you can almost blame the other person, even though they have no idea who you are, what your background is. And then the person behind you in the queue, that they're having the exact same situation with the cashier will be slow, but they get on and have a lovely morning or a lovely day. So you've had two people in the same situation, but the response is completely different and it's entirely chosen by the person to be stressed or not be stressed. Although it's probably more, it's easier to kind of practice that, to talk about that in a book rather than in real life. But it is handy to kind of think about that. How you feel. Sometimes you might think it's outside of your control, but how you choose to react in a situation is well within your control. So I thought that was quite helpful. In these chapters as well, she does give an example about somebody who's doing really well at work and they don't get the promotion or the bonus or whatever it is that they wanted. And she's basically using the let them theory in this situation by saying, let them not promote you, let them promote the other person who doesn't deserve it. And then let me react to that by updating your CV or going out to the job market and getting the job that you do deserve or whatever. In that example, I didn't massively resonate with that because I personally wouldn't have reacted in that way. I would say, let me talk to the boss, let me talk to the company, let me show that I want to be hungry for the promotion. So that kind of showed a bit of a crack in the let them, let me theory for me, because the let me part, which is how do I react to the situation, is up for a lot of interpretation and different people interpret in different ways. And I think sometimes people might make the wrong choice. I don't know whether you could say that, but I think where it's so up for interpretation, that is a bit of a weakness in the theory. At least it is from my perspective. There was a nice quote actually on the back of one of these pages here. And it says, the more you let other people live their lives, the better your life gets. And to be fair, I think that's actually a really nice quote just before you get into the managing stress section. The next chapter after managing stress is fearing other people's opinions. This one is interesting because I think this is something that everybody suffers with, even if they don't admit that they actually do, particularly people when they're younger. I guess as you get older, this is probably less of a problem. But she talks about how fear essentially is ruining lots of people's lives. It's almost a bit of a blocker. Because you're so worried about what everyone else is thinking that you actually don't do the things that you want to do. So you're being held back by things that aren't really that important. So you're being held back by other people. But the funny thing is that you can't control what other people think anyway. So it's almost just like a useless thing that we're doing for some reason. She does try to bring some research into some of the chapters as well. And she basically said that there's around people on average have about 70,000 thoughts in a day. And I think the reason why she talks about that is because if you're having 70,000 thoughts, you can't even control yourself. How can you control the thoughts of other people if there's 70,000 thoughts from your brother, 70,000 thoughts from your friend, from your dad, from whoever, from your mum? So how can you expect to control what other people think anyway? So realistically, you should just let them think what they want and let you do whatever it is you need to do and not be so worried about other people's opinions. She gives quite a nice and personal example about how she delayed her motivational speaking career for around 2 years. This resonated quite a lot actually, because she basically said that she was so worried about what her friends and family were going to say for her having a speaking career and being that person. Oh, you're a motivational speaker. How could you do that? That she said that she it pushed her career back further than if she just started and didn't worry about other people's opinions. And I could resonate a lot with that because I personally do overthink sometimes about what other people think when in reality, it's not that important really. When you sit there and really think about it, I don't understand why we let other people's opinions hold us back, particularly of people we may not even know. Obviously, there are some people in our lives where their opinion is helpful and it's valid, but when you're an adult, I'm not sure you should use it as something to hold you back. But again, it's easier said than done. She introduces a concept called frame of reference in chapter 6. I think this is just a rebrand of what I would call emotional intelligence. It's essentially putting yourself in someone else's shoes in terms of having their point of view or looking from their point of reference, if that makes sense. And she said she kind of brings that in as a way to kind of say, for you to understand why other people might be thinking the way they're thinking, saying what they're thinking, because realistically, we might take things to heart and might think other people have bad intentions when in reality, what they're saying is valid. What they're saying has come from a place of love, but we just don't understand why or their background or their history. She gives an example with her husband and her mum, and basically long story short, her husband and her moved to a different part of the US, far away from her mum, and her mum was didn't have massively great feelings about that, and I think she let Mel know about that. That she wasn't. That she, I think she said something like she wouldn't have chose her partner Chris for her or something like that. And I think Mel massively resented her mum for that for years and years and years until she basically realised that when her mum was younger, she'd done something similar where she moved away from their parents and they really struggled when it came to raising the family, childcare, having that connection, etc., etc. So the reason why her mum was saying those things and had that those thoughts and feelings was because her frame of reference was something of very, very similar. So her mum was actually coming from a place of love, a place of care, but it might have come across to Mel as if she was being critical or trying to control her. And Mel basically goes on to say that after thinking about her mum's frame of reference, it made it a lot easier to deal with that kind of relationship that her and her mum had and the situation with her husband, which obviously resolved itself after a few years anyway. Quite a nice quote in this section was around, she said, people can only meet you as deeply as they meet themselves. And I think that's probably quite powerful to think about because realistically, you do always have to give the other person the benefit of the doubt almost, not to your own detriment, but you always need to just ask yourself a question. Why is that other person being like that? Why is this other person, why have they got that point of view? And I don't think we do enough of that today. I don't think we often put ourselves in the shoes of the other side, whether it's to do with politics or relationships or friendships. We don't use this frame of reference term anywhere near enough because more or less people don't have bad intentions. They just have a different perspective. And I think that's often lost in a lot of arguments. The next section is dealing with someone else's emotional reactions. So she talks about her therapist or someone she knows who works in therapy or something like that. And she basically said that most adults are just 8-year-olds in adult bodies. And I thought that was quite funny and interesting. And she gives all these examples about how kids might run away and then an adult version of that could be giving the silent treatment, kids throwing tantrums, but then adults might do spam loads of rage texts or whatever. And I thought that was quite an interesting thing to think about, actually, because there are definitely some people in my life and even myself where some of these immature behaviors probably do creep up on us as adults. I think one of the reasons that Mel has put this in the book is almost to kind of give you that prompt to say, that other person might be acting immature, that other person might be throwing a tantrum or whatever it might be, but it's actually because of their past, and everyone has this it's kind of like lingering inner child within them even as an adult. It does actually answer a lot of questions in terms of some of the situations I've been in my life when I've kind of asked myself, why has that person reacted in that way? So that's kind of given me a bit of at least something to think about. But as a result of this chapter, she says that one of the reasons for this is because when a lot of people are growing up, they often suppress their emotions. So people are told to get over it. They're told to calm down. So they don't actually develop the tools to regulate themselves. And this trickles through into adulthood as well. So you might get glimpses of people acting really childish. One of the tips she does give for you is to visualize a person as, for example, like an 8-year-old. If someone is throwing a bit of an adult tantrum, that sometimes it's helpful for you just to visualize them as that 8-year-old version of themselves. And it helps you develop a bit more compassion for that person rather than just a conflict. And quite often, if you're emotionally regulated enough to do that, then it keeps you out of the kind of whirlwind of those sorts of things. There are definitely times in my life where someone else might have been acting in that certain way. And then when you haven't got that kind of emotional foresight that this person is just, it's just their inner child coming out, it's often easy to get caught up in all of that as well. So I do think you do need to be quite careful in terms of that visualization of them being a child, particularly if you're dealing with another adult, because you don't want to start treating them like a child, because that can often have the opposite effect, I think, actually, that Mel's trying to get to in here. And obviously, you need to treat adults as adults, but at the same time as well, you don't also want to use this as a justification or excuse for some people to be acting in certain ways that aren't acceptable. So again, I take this section with a pinch of salt, but nevertheless, it's still quite interesting to talk about. This section here, so this is overcoming chronic comparison. So she talks about two types of comparison. There's torture comparison, which doesn't sound great, and teacher comparison. So torture comparison is something I think we all would have suffered with. I know I definitely did when I was younger. And this is basically where you kind of tear yourself apart, comparing yourself to other people to do with things that are just well outside of your control and you have no influence over whatsoever. So she talks about things like genetics, or let's say one of your friends has got a massive inheritance, things that are just so outside of your control, you have no influence over, and you just chronically compare yourself to these people, and it doesn't do you any good, and it isn't productive. And then she tries to flip that on its head and says that you need to focus on something called teacher comparison, which is more around looking at where other people are that you want to get to, but for achievable things. So one example might be if one of your friends is doing really well in the gym and in a diet and like dieting and looking really well and is healthy, that's probably within your control, more or less, to kind of mimic that and use that comparison as a way to teach you to get to the goals you want to get to. But if somebody is really, really tall, they've got really great bone structure, whatever it might be, there's not much you can really do to look like that person. And doing that comparison with that person is only going to bring you down and tear you down and put you in a bad place. So she encourages this kind of teacher comparison, which I think is quite a healthy thing to do. She talks about something I thought was quite interesting: jealousy being an invitation from your future self. It's almost inviting you to say, you're feeling a bit jealous here, and kind of asking yourself the question, why do I feel jealous? Is this something that I want to get to? So when that person walks down the street and they do look really good, they have been eating well and going to the gym, that's almost an invitation to you. And you should use that as fuel to kind of get to the goals where you want to get to. So there's healthy comparison and I guess unhealthy comparison, what I got from her. She gives an example of one of her friends who's an interior designer. And one of her, I can't remember all the details, but she basically is a successful interior designer and someone that they know has got less experience. She blows up on social media. She's getting all the work and all the clients, all the attention that she wanted to get to. And Mel more or less says you should use that as a fuel to basically show you that this is possible to do. So rather than being bitter, that isn't going to help you get your business off the ground. You should be supportive and say, well done. How do I do the same thing? There's a nice quote in this section too, and this is around other people's wins are not your losses. And I think sometimes, particularly when I was younger, it's quite easy to see someone else doing really, really well. And you almost let your jealousy or the bad side of jealousy kind of set in and you just spiral down and down and down. It doesn't actually get you anywhere. So I guess you need to try to flip your jealousy on its head and turn it into that teacher of comparison. The section after that is around mastering adult friendship. Now, this one hit me quite deeply because she talks about this concept called the great scattering. And to kind of paraphrase the great scattering is essentially as you grow up, your kind of core groups of friends from school, from your local area, as you grow up, that you kind of disperse across the country, the world, you're all doing different things. And just by kind of nature, you might lose contact with a lot of people and your friendship groups do diminish. And I feel as if this is quite relatable for me because there's lots of examples of where I might have had some really good friends back in the day and we're not as close as we were before. And in this chapter, it talks quite a lot around, I guess, almost like resentment and that rejection feeling of why, oh, why am I not friends with this person anymore? But she talks about how it's natural as you get older to probably have less friendships. And she also, there's some research she brings into this section as well around something around 74 hours is how much time you need to spend with somebody for them to become a friend. And then 200 hours is how you become a close friend. And as we get older, we're not at school anymore. We're not playing in the same sports teams as much. We have less opportunity to make these friends anyway as you get older. So people are scattering all over the place. So you need to try to not frame that in a rejection way, but just realize actually it's just a natural part of growing up and kind of life developing. So there's three pillars of friendship. There's proximity, how close you are with somebody, timing, where you are in your lives, and the amount of energy you might have. Because there could be two best friends when you're at school, but as you get older, one, they move to different places. One of you might have a family really young. One of you might get a job where you have to go all around the world, and you'll naturally drift apart. And you're going to have different proximity. You'll have different timings of things you want to do, and you'll have different levels of energy as well. So, long story short, try not to be resentful of kind of old friendships or thinking how other people might be not wanting to be your friend when it actually it's just a natural thing. She gives a bit of a story around how she moved to a new town. And one of the things I did really like about this chapter, how she says this kind of move first. And what this essentially means is stop relying on other people to become your friend. Be that person who initiates the kind of friendship. So she gives some really light-hearted examples in terms of walking down the street or in the coffee shop, just saying hello to people, or being that first person in an exercise class to say, hey, how are you? Or if you know a couple of people, you can invite them to go for a walk. And then at some point in the book, she talks about this walking club that she starts a couple of people. And then after a few years, there's hundreds of people going up this mountain and back. And it all started from one conversation she had. So I think the move first concept is actually quite powerful and definitely worthwhile thinking about. And then the chapter after that is called Motivating Other People to Change. Now, these next two chapters resonated quite a lot with me, just in terms of some of my close friends and family. This chapter is essentially around there being someone in your life that you think they need to change for the better. And I get the impression that Mel is the type of person who, particularly with her friends and family, she maybe used to overstep her boundaries, but from a good place. So from her perspective, she would push other people to change from her point of view. But the person on the receiving end, maybe her kids, might be quite resentful of that kind of pushy behavior. And she goes on to talk about how you can't actually change people. You can't force change in people. It actually should come from within the person themselves. It sounds a bit cheesy, actually, talking it back. But she says guilt tripping people or forcing them or buying them a new pair of shoes and a gym membership, that isn't going to make them want to change themselves. They have to make that choice from within to make that change actually happen. She spoke to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist research basically said that people always naturally move towards the thing that feels good. And they're obviously going to move away from the things that feels bad. And there's some examples around someone laying on the sofa, they're getting overweight and they're eating snacks, right? That's the easy thing to do. So they're naturally going to gravitate to that. But then when you start trying to speak to people around this person on the couch, for example, there's a person from UCL, some sort of a neuroscientist, and they've done some research that the brain apparently actually switches off when somebody is trying to talk to you about change when you're not ready for it. So it's not even worth doing, because actually in people's brains, the switch is off. So you're wasting your time trying to actually get somebody to change. She talks about this thing called the ABC loop when it comes to change. So A being apologize. So if you have been that person that has been trying to get someone else to change, apologize for doing that, give them the space. And then B is backing off, and giving them that kind of breathing space that you're not trying to force them to change. You're kind of letting them do it themselves. And then C is celebrate. So any of these micro wins that they might have, let's say, for example, someone does go to the gym and they only go for 10 minutes, celebrating that rather than, I guess, berating them for not going for a full hour like you might do, for example. But a part of this ABC loop is modeling the change for yourself. So if you do want to motivate someone else to change, you need to also be able to walk the walk yourself. So if you want somebody to go to the gym, for example, then you should already be going to the gym and modeling that change for them to see. The chapter after that is around helping somebody who is struggling. So this is almost a continuation on motivating people to change, right? Because if someone's struggling, then you're going to obviously want to do this even more. And I get the feeling there's been a lot of people in her life, in Mel's life, that she's wanted to do this for. And that's why I think there's two big chapters on this section. But some of the things she talks about in here, which I found was interesting, is that healing is a choice, similar to the chapter before, is that somebody isn't going to want to get better. Let's say they've got some sort of alcohol problem or a drug addiction. That person needs to choose to get better. No matter how often you force them to change, that choice has to come from within them and they have to choose to want to get better. And she says, you need to move away from trying to rescue people, because the more you try to rescue people, the more you actually push them away. And the only way for some people to actually get to that point of wanting to change is for them to face the consequences of whatever it is that they're doing. So if they're binge eating and they get really overweight, or you're drinking or you're taking drugs, she basically says sometimes it has to get to that point of breaking for them to actually then realize themselves and make that choice to want to heal. She does go on at the end, near the end of this chapter, to talk about what real support should actually look like. So she wants people to move away from trying to rescue people to giving people that space to actually heal for themselves. And this could be things like looking after the kids for somebody else who's struggling. It could be for cooking them a dinner. It could be sending them a text just to say, hey, I hope you're okay. Or if you want to talk, I won't, there's not a judgment attached to it. She talks about creating an environment for people to change within without actually having to rescue people themselves. What I would say with this chapter, though, is that you do need to be careful with this, because if somebody is in a dire place, right, and some people may never get to the point where they are going to change. There's all sorts of conditions that you can probably think of where sometimes a forced intervention probably is the only way to help them. So I think this section needs to be taken with a bit of a pinch of salt, but it's nevertheless, it's quite interesting. The last one is around choosing the love you deserve. So this is probably my least favorite chapter of the whole book. There is an interesting quote there, and I did write this on my whiteboard. I tried to write quotes on there. And it says, if they like you, you'll know. If not, you'll be confused. And I think that was really interesting, because when somebody really does like you, it's so obvious, right? And she's basically saying, if you're confused whether someone likes you or not, then that's probably your answer in itself. So you can make of that what you want to. But she talks a bit more about relationships in a bit more detail, talking about acceptance of the other person you're in a relationship with. So not having that constant resentment of that other person. Let's say, for example, your partner is making bad choices. They are getting overweight, unhealthy. She basically talks about giving them the space to actually change and using maybe that ABC kind of method on them to try to help encourage them. But at the end of the day, you need to not be resentful of these people, because being with that person is a choice that you are actually making. And I think there's a bit of a controversial kind of element in here as well around if it does get to that point where they're refusing to change and that's not something you want to accept, then you need to make the decision whether you should leave that relationship or not. So that's why I think it's called choosing the love you deserve. And because there are certain thresholds that might be reached where you actually should exit the relationship. And I think that bit for me was quite a difficult part to kind of comprehend and get over in this section. I think you definitely need to be careful with this chapter as well, because I think some people might take some of the stuff at face value, and they might just leave their partner, right? Because I've read this, and let them theory, for example. But it's definitely something to think about. So my overall summary of the let them theory, I would say that it's a good concept overall. It's quite catchy, right? I mean, you can fit it on a post-it note, as I've got loads on here. Let them, let me. I wouldn't say that there's anything groundbreakingly new in here, particularly if you're reading in lots of books in this space anyway. If this is a new kind of topic for you, this book would be fantastic. But if you're already reading books and watching podcasts, I don't think there'll be anything massively new in here for you. I'd probably give this book a 3.5. I probably wouldn't give it a 4. Maybe it's because I've been reading lots of books in this space. I did think it was a helpful book. Lots of people have said online that this book could be condensed down to a smaller book. I do agree with that kind of view, but there are also lots of kind of helpful examples. And sometimes it is helpful to put this theory in lots of different situations as well. And I think that's what she's tried to do by having quite a few different topics. But that said, you could have a really small, punchy version of this that would probably be quite helpful to read. But I'd just like to finish by saying I do think you need to be really careful with this whole let them and let me theory, because if you just let them, right, you just let them, you stop trying to control everybody, you stop caring, I guess, caring about other people, you're going to end up in a world of isolation. And, because if you stop caring about other people, you only just focus on yourself. Yes, that might help to some degree, but you could end up massively isolated. And then the let me part is down to interpretation as well. So I do think you need to be careful with let me, because different people will let me do something completely different. That work example earlier, let me go find a new job, or let me try to tackle the issue head on. So I think it goes down to your personality. But that said, I do think this book is probably helpful for your everyday person who might not be too involved with this space. So just want to say thank you so much for watching this video, listening along to this review with me. If you do want to get hold of the book, I'll put a link to it in the description below. But other than that, thank you very much and have a good day.